But I think the biggest thing is you look at something right now, like the U.S. women's national soccer team.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at dollars for, advertising and viewership versus the men, like how can you not? And so it's one of those things like, and none of this stuff is easy. Nothing that ever has happened in terms of civil rights or progress has been.
Right.
But that shouldn't stop us from trying.
Decide on the value first. Like, it's we do this a lot in class, ethics versus morals. Or, your ethic is sort of the social value, the cultural value. We all agree or mostly agree on this. And then morals are individually what you think, and your morals may not match the society's ethics and all that. But it's like we could probably agree that people should be paid and treated equally, fairly, all the rest. And then you got to work on the details, which is where it would get hard. All right, so for the women's soccer, since you brought it up, I haven't written anything for the website in a couple of weeks. I've been putting a lot of time into doing these recordings and figuring all this stuff out. But the last thing I did, and I ended up not posting it because I didn't know how to finish it, was looking at the pay issues. And I have no idea what to do because in the United States, especially in years like just last year or whatever, when the men's team doesn't even make it to the World Cup, like you don't even make it into the final tournament, the women should be making a lot more money, right? But then when you look at it like from FIFA's perspective or when you do like the international thing, most countries' women's teams don't attract that viewership. And so like I started off like writing this thing and like linking articles and I'm like, pay them. And then the more I looked at it, I'm like, pay them, but because like the money isn't really there, and so like I got so turned around on it, like my mind changed 10 different times that I have an article saved with like all this research linked in and there's just nothing at the end because I'm like, I have no idea, like why should they be paid more?
So same thing
or any
with
part
me.
of the crap I just spewed.
Right. And like reading articles, like you just get so much more information than you just start to question. But there's this great interview with Megan Rapinoe on Pod Save America after they won, and where she talks about it. And the lawsuit that's currently ongoing isn't against FIFA; it's against
U.S. Soccer,
U.S. Soccer Federation. And, when they talk about that paying, a lot of it is like advertising dollars and viewership and jersey sales, which the women are just like exceedingly more than men in that revenue. And it is. I don't have the answer, but
like
she had a lot of great information being at the center of it.
And in that regard, like what would probably make the most sense and maybe it wouldn't, but I think what would make the most sense, where you sort of make all sides a little happy. Like I say this all the time, that we've gotten very bad at compromising, like as a culture, and it's because we think that compromise is supposed to make everyone happy. And I personally think that compromise is about making everyone equally unhappy, but with an end result that's a little bit better than you have now.
Right.
In the end, we're at least a little bit better off than we are now. And everybody has approximately equal things to complain about. Like, don't think about how happy you'll be. Is it better, And so, but a compromise would just be like, pick a percentage. Players, men, women, whatever, take in X percent of all the revenue. Jersey sales, advertising, television contracts, whatever. And then that way, if women have better viewership or they get that money. If men have it, they get the money. But then you don't necessarily have to argue it. You just say, here's the number, and get good and popular. And I'm sure that's not a perfect solution, but I think it makes everyone equally unhappy,
And there was the one fact I didn't know. There was this funny interview with Hassan Minhaj and some of the women's soccer players, and that the men get paid if they lose. The women do not.
Yeah. And if you look at the figures,
so that's like
Yeah, maybe when I post this, I can I won't use my trash article that I can't figure out, but I can there's some sources that I have that show the direct pay comparison, and it's insane. Some of them you can't explain with international money and the rest, and some of them just you can't really. And those are the places where you really have to do something, because if you can't explain the disparity, then there shouldn't be one. Or if you have to work too hard to explain it, then that shouldn't be there. There are some cases, again, where you start looking at the international money. I understand how that can play out differently. All right, so I'm gonna just one more thing on that because this is really where I got stuck. I've been doing a lot of this in my AP classes, is teaching kids not to accept premises. Like, just don't accept the premise of someone else's argument, because you end up arguing these details, and maybe you disagree with the broader thing. And so the question is, should men and women be paid equally for soccer? Yes or no? But then you say, well, why would they be paid differently? Well, they're playing different games. Should we divide men and women's sports?
So
should they be playing separately at all?
This is a really interesting topic, and one my husband and I have been recently talking about. So last year I went to South Africa. I got to chaperone 8 students for this Girls Leadership Summit.
Awesome.
And it was all these amazing speakers, and one was a sports psychologist, and she was talking about Caster Semenya, who's a South African runner. And so and in her discussion, it brought up so many questions, because it's like, what is the premise and dividing things based on sex and gender? And so, I said to my husband, we cannot deny that there are differences biologically between men and women.
Yeah, there are huge differences, especially in the average. I mean, there's always overlap, and that's the question. Like,
there's a sliding spectrum.
There are some women that absolutely could compete with the men.
Mm-hmm.
The question is it enough to make that actual fair access to play a game in the rest? And that's actually the Caster Semenya dispute. I wrote a short thing about right after the court ruled, and then realized that most major news organizations were not fully reporting the situation. Like, they didn't actually address her biology,
right?
Which does change. Like, at first I thought, what an outrage! How can they tell her she can't compete as a woman and do all the rest? And then, but biologically, she really is intersex. Like, if you just did a blood test, you would think that's a man, right? And so that's a very tricky and very specific situation. Mm-hmm. I think the conversation, everyone took it to this broad thing, and it's like, that court ruled on something very specific, and they tried to be as delicate and respectful as they could in it. I read the whole thing, but in that situation, where should she be competing? Right. And so, I threw it to students near the end of the school year. I in my public speaking class, we had some extra time, and there were a few girls who played varsity lacrosse and soccer, and I just said, why do we do it? Why do we separate men's and women's sports? And for some of it's the patriarchy, and in some cases they pointed out little things like, you say, well, men and women can't compete in, say, the discus or shot put, like track and field, because they're different weight. Mm-hmm. It's a different weight. But I was like, but we made that rule. It's a sport. You literally make up all the rules. Right. You just change the rule and everyone can do it. And one of the girls said, and she's great, I taught her in AP 11th grade and public speaking 12th grade, and she said, she goes, I don't know about the professional stuff, she said, but if you're thinking about youth sports in high school and maybe even through college, she said, if you only had one team, so few young women would make the team that you'd be missing out on all the other things that come with sports. And
Mm-hmm.
I was like, most of these kids in high school aren't playing professional. Most of them aren't playing in college,
right.
But some kids learn more in their after-school activities than they actually do in the classroom, right? And so I would never want to deny that opportunity. And so it makes sense to do that division. When you're a professional and you're being paid, should at the international or professional thing, should we just throw everyone together? My gut reaction is no, but I don't know why I'm saying that.
And I think it's interesting with the big news cases being track and field, where you're not physically coming into contact with other
non-contact
players.
Sport, yeah.
Right. So, we talked about it. If you go sport by sport, let's say something like football, like American football, which there aren't, as far as I know, maybe besides some intramural type things, women's football teams.
Yeah, I think they did that in the 70s, actually.
Yeah. That comes down to perhaps a safety issue, if you're going up against 300, 400-pound linebackers, that's a big difference. But in the sports psychologist in South Africa, she was kind of throwing these things out. Like, if you look at something, say, swimming, track and field, those type of sports, like, should you divide it time? Like, if you can run, an under 4-minute mile, you compete, male, female, in this.
So,
like weight classes,
do you
like
golf?
wrestling.
Do you golf?
No.
Okay, I know your
My
husband
husband
golfs,
does,
so I since I've had kids, I don't
Yeah.
golf. But when you do like most like club championships, they actually divide it into flights. There's like
Yes.
there's the championship or the players or whatever, and then there's the open division, and then you'll have a junior thing, and then women's, and sometimes for a bigger club they'll even divide the women's into your best players. They do it by handicap, and that way everyone has a level to compete on. But even then, even in golf, where like they still do that division, and so.
And it's interesting you bring that up because we were just talking. I've learned so much about golf since being married to him, like the different tee boxes and what they would call the ladies' tees. And he was recently playing in a tournament, and there were two young women who were college players in golf, and where men kind of have this stigma about playing at the ladies' tees, but might not necessarily be able to drive and play from the back
you probably
tees.
should be playing from
Right.
that. Yeah.
So he said he was watching this unfold in a tournament where these two college player girls were just like striping it from the back tees and just showing up these two kind of somewhat, middle-aged white men who really, he was like, their golf, where they were at in their skill, should have been playing from the front tees, but because they're labeled ladies' tees, it's seen as...
and I think it's the USGA has been... I used to work at Algonquin Golf Course, and so I kept up on stuff a little better because I was in the pro shop and I talked with the pro there a lot. But they were actually working to try to change the language, because your red tees up close were women's or ladies. Then you have gold, which is seniors, like 55 and up or 60 and up. And then you have like your white tees, sort of regular playing golf. And then you have blues for if you're really good or you hit the ball far. And then usually like black is like your pro, or you're really good, you're a scratch golfer kind of deal. And what they're trying to do is get rid of that and basically set it up by how good are you. Like so if you're not that great, play from the closer one. Right. You're going to play better, you're going to score better, and maybe more importantly for the business side, you'll play faster, which means a round of golf shouldn't take you more than 4 hours, and it always does.
Oh my gosh.
And, that's why I haven't played. I got two kids. I'm like, man, I'm lucky if I can get out for an hour, let alone 4. But you make that division. That being said, like in golf, maybe that makes more sense. I don't know if you can like handicap a track meet like that though. Can you put everyone on the same track and have the guys start from 30 meters behind? Like, is that a reasonable solution? I don't know.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I don't know, and who and where and how is this going to start? To change.
Yeah, and it's in a way it's separate from the other conversation, because when you have a discussion of, say, sports or athletics, you're focusing in that discussion. There's plenty of psychology in sports, but almost all of that discussion focused specifically on biological differences. The average stride, like the reason men and women use different height hurdles is the average length of your stride and how high your hips are off the ground on average. And in looking this stuff up, like I don't think it's the record. I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago they did this study. Somebody did all this research at like Johns Hopkins or Duke or something, where they looked at the best women's time for like the 200 meter or something, and then they compared it to guys. And the fastest American women's time for like that whole year, or for the last couple of years, whatever it was, had been beaten like 14,000 times by men, including a lot of kids in high school. You have the fastest woman in the country, and you've got just fast kids, like males in high school being, and you go, all right, the fact, like that's a thing you have to address. Yeah. And if you want people to have access to play and all that, then it makes sense to do some kind of division, whether it's by skill or by sex or whatever it is. That conversation probably doesn't need to factor into the rest of it, though, in terms of a person's access to pay or education or for a job. Like, the athletic piece is interesting. Like, it's really fun to talk about. It's hard to think about when you actually look at the data. But that probably has no bearing when it comes to the broader, like, political issue of, right to, say, family leave or fair pay and work. And it's one of those times we put them it turns into the same conversation because it turns into the classic boys versus girls. But like, they're not the same thing,
right?
You know, you said the draft thing.
Yeah.
Do you do that in class? Do you talk with kids in women's studies class about like? I mean, you point out like that's one of the things that people go like, well, but what if you did this? Women would have to be drafted. Do you talk about that in class?
Oh yeah, and you know when I explained what the ERA was, and I actually showed an interview clip where it was Good Morning America or the Today Show, and it was Betty Friedan and Phyllis Schlafly debating the ERA, and so Phyllis brought up the draft, and you can see Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, rolls her eyes, like her facial expressions were great in it. And it's like, again, I like what you said, like don't accept someone's premise of their argument, you know, step back and just look at the draft in general.
That's what I was just going to say. Like people say like, well, should women be drafted? I'm like, first,
should men?
Should anyone be drafted? And if you can't answer the first question, don't even try to answer the second one. And that's where like, should men and women be paid the same in soccer? Should they be playing separately? And then you go, well, you can make the argument that I don't love this, but there is some truth in it. If the men are that much better at the sport, whether they're winning or not, if they're just that much better, you can make the argument that based purely on the skill on the field, you've earned some of that money. I don't know that that's fair, especially with advertising stuff. But then you go to like the draft issue, you know, it's immediately, well, should women be drafted? And like, hold up.
Right.
Should anyone?
Yeah.